So, have you ever wondered what the differences are between AAA game development and indie game development might be, or how they might actually be a lot more similar than we think they are? Well, I've spent time in both spaces, so I thought maybe it's worth putting some of these thoughts down on video and actually give you some sneak peeks into my current game in development by providing you some time lapse video of that development as it's going. Let's get to it. So, something that came up in one of my recent videos about the road to Steam is I got to talking about a lot of the kind of sidebarring that I had to do in order to get a Steam page up and running and functional and get all the media that is required in order for it to be allowed to go live. And as somewhere in that process, the interesting question came up from friends of mine saying, hey, why are you working on these visuals but like long before the rest of the game still is in flux and still getting worked out? And so that made me think a little bit about kind of the interesting collision of assumptions that I had made before I jumped into the indie game developer space. I come from 25 years of development at a variety of different size studios. Some of them were very small, some mid-size, and others were the big publishers, your EA and Activision. And in working all those, I saw a variety of different milestones and demo scenarios that we as developers in the AAA space pretty much universally dislike, which is having to constantly prove that we're worthy of the payment that is coming along. Well, that sounds really bad the way I put it there, right? But it's really the idea that we had to keep putting together demos in order to justify, the payments, whether they were monthly payments or quarterly payments or whatever the cadence is there. That all took the form of milestones and demos. Sometimes they're one and the same. Sometimes they're both actually operating at the same time. And from working in AAA, you sit there and you dream about the day, hey, if I was running my own studio or if I was doing my own thing, or especially if I was in an indie game developer space, I wouldn't have to deal with any of that. And you're like, now we can just like not worry about that stuff. Just do the work in the order in which that it makes the most sense. And then you move on. Because ultimately in the AAA space, when you're putting those demos together, you're usually halting some amount of forward progress on other efforts across the game. And that's why we generally kind of disliked that kind of work, because it meant that we didn't feel like we were making forward progress, or we felt like we were doing throwaway work, was usually the most common way we would describe it, which isn't entirely true, but I'll get to that in a sec. So we do all those demos, proving out, even internally, you do those demos. So at those big guys, the EA or Activision studios, or publishers, I should say, you're still having to do demonstrations to the higher ups that your team is actually on track to do what it's supposed to do. Sometimes there are very particular, specific types of meetings. So like you might have heard the term green light, and that's usually a very early on milestone, usually somewhere in the first third or so of doing the project, where you put all the stuff together into as small of a demonstration as possible that can prove that this is what we're going to make. This is what we're going to spit out in 2, 3, whatever number of years from there. And this is what it'll hopefully look like. This is kind of how it'll play like. These are the technical things we might try and tackle. And so you do those in order to get the green light to continue on with the rest of the project. And so even internally, you're still beholden to all that stuff. And there's usually other kind of milestone-y demos along the way. So I jumped into the indie space here, thinking, I don't have to worry about that anymore, right? Well, it turns out I still do. From listening to all the research from some marketers out there, I think I mentioned him in my previous video, Chris Sikowski, him and some of the other people that he's talked to all generally seem to agree that in order to market and get the most out of your product, you want to get your Steam page up and running as soon as possible, get so that people can wishlist it, you can send calls to action to it and all that kind of fun stuff. So I found myself looking at it going, man, I didn't think I needed to put a Steam page together for another 6 months, but I was like, you know what, that's 6 months that I can't make anything and tell people, hey, if you like the idea of this game, go let me know by wishlisting it. So I said, all right, I'm gonna listen to that marketing wisdom and I'm gonna go after it. And in doing so, that's where I ran into the questions from other friends of mine, dev friends of mine, who were like, why are you doing this now? Why aren't you just doing the thing that we all think you probably would have been doing if you didn't have to do this stuff? And ultimately, at the end of the day, it just becomes this ironic part about shifting from AAA development to indie development that actually ends up staying the same, which is that you're still ultimately a slave to marketing for your product. So I thought that was an interesting kind of outlook on how things are, and a unique perspective that not necessarily AAA devs would have, or indie developers would have, seeing as how there are a lot of them that haven't worked in either of those two other spaces before. And I thought I would just bring that up and let you know, what my experience has been so far after jumping into this space. So in my other video, I explained that I had to make some different biomes, so I could produce screenshots that showed off different environments that my game would actually show off. And in doing so, I essentially worked through a small process that mirrors what the AAA developers would see on just about every project in the last 20-something years of what we call a vertical slice, and more specifically, what we would sometimes call a beautiful corner, right? So the vertical slice, for those of you who haven't heard that term before, is really just, it would feature, it's actually kind of a big feature that would play into like those green light meetings, for instance, or those bigger milestones where you're trying to prove this is the game we want to make. But the vertical slice is really just, if you think of your whole game and every system in the game and every gameplay mechanic and all the different levels, and you thought of them as this like horizontal bar, and you just want to take this thin little vertical slice of it right down the middle of him and get like one little snippet of all of those beats or aspects of your game, that would be a vertical slice. And that's usually the goal of one of those kind of bigger green light demos, is to prove that out as much as you can without building the rest of it. And somewhere in the middle of that, at least on the visual side, you would have what we would more specifically call, what I said earlier, the beautiful corner. And that can be as big or as small as either like a good sized chunk of a level, or it could literally just be a corner of your game where you throw up a camera and you can't look any left or right. You just make everything in that view look the way you think it should look when you finally ship the game. And so that's essentially what I did, is I had, camera view for like these 4 different levels, and I took all my art and I started making new versions that matched what I hope to have in each of those biomes to get my beautiful corner. And the nice thing about that is that this is the part that isn't throwaway work, or shouldn't be throwaway work. Sometimes it still happens, in the AAA space, let me tell you. But you ultimately have assets being built for that you should then be able to propagate throughout the rest of your game. And even if you have to revisit those assets, ideally, it's done in such a way that even if you do have to make changes, it's like you make that change in one spot. Now everywhere else, it's good to go. And that's largely what I've done. And so it won't show up as throwaway work for me. And there's nothing else that I've done so far that would be wasted work, or work that I wouldn't have to do somewhere down the road anyway. It's just that I've had to do it in a slightly different order than I normally would have thought to. So that's been the good part about this process. so far, and it's also something that I would say that every indie game should be doing, and probably naturally does some version of this anyway. But it was interesting to contrast and compare, my experience in the AAA space versus my burgeoning experience here in the indie space. So let me know if you like hearing this little tidbit. I'm sure that I'll come up with more. So if you like these, I can throw more of these into a quick video and let you know what it's been like to experience the indie scene after coming off of so many years in the AAA scene. Let you know the kind of similarities and the differences between the two. I'm sure more of these will pop into my head as I go along. So if you happen to like it, just let me know, and we'll go from there. But that's where I'll leave it today. Thanks for listening. I'll see you later.